Everyone in the camp called it a cardboard coffin. She kept building anyway. By the time the temperature hit -19, the people who had laughed the hardest were the ones knocking on her door. Subscribe. This one is worth your full attention. There is a particular kind of cold that does not negotiate. Not the kind that makes you walk faster from your car to the front door, or that gives you a good reason to order soup for lunch. The kind that public health offices in northern Montana prepare press releases about 4 days in advance because they already know someone is going to die in it. They just don't know who yet. In Bozeman, in January of 2011, that kind of cold was coming. The Weather Service discussions, not the public forecasts, but the technical internal documents written in language most people skip, were using words like historic and sustained radiative cooling event and life-threatening wind chill potential. Most people in Bozeman read the regular forecast, saw the number, and turned up their thermostats. Elena Voss read the technical documents. She read them on a public computer at the Gallatin County Library, sitting in the same chair she used most mornings, wearing a red jacket that had seen better days, and she understood exactly what those words meant. She had a graduate degree in materials engineering from Colorado State. She had spent 3 years at a firm in Denver testing thermal performance of building materials under extreme conditions. She knew what sustained radiative cooling event meant down to the physics of it, the way a cloudless January sky in Montana pulls heat off the ground and bleeds it upward into space with nothing to slow it down, the way temperatures in that scenario don't just drop, but keep dropping, degree by degree, through the night, through the next day, through the next night. She also knew she was going to be sleeping outside when it happened. That particular fact still had the texture of something that hadn't fully arrived yet, even after 7 months of living rough along the Gallatin River corridor. The mind protects itself. It keeps filing certain truths under temporary long after the evidence has stopped supporting that classification. 7 months earlier, she had been a materials engineer with a salary, an apartment in Denver's Capitol Hill neighborhood, and a clear sense of what her life was going to look like. Then she had filed an internal report documenting what she believed to be systematic falsification of thermal performance data on a federal building contract. Within 6 weeks, she was out of a job. Within 4 months, she was out of savings. Within 5, she was here. She closed the browser window, thanked the librarian out of habit, and walked back toward the river. She had 3 weeks before the cold arrived. She intended to use all of them. The encampment along the Gallatin River was not a community in any organized sense of the word, but it had become one in the way that shared circumstances always eventually produce. Roughly 30 people occupied a stretch of riverbank behind a shuttered industrial facility on River Road, sheltered by a dense corridor of cottonwood and willow that blocked the worst of the wind and kept them invisible from the road. They were there for different reasons and had stayed for the same one. Nobody came down to bother them. Ray Calloway, who everyone called Tex, had been there the longest of the regulars. He was 52, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that suggested he had found most of what life had thrown at him genuinely funny, right up until he hadn't. He'd worked oil pipeline welding across 5 states for 20 years. Then a back injury had taken the work, and the work had taken everything else in a sequence that felt, in retrospect, almost too efficient to be accidental. Tex was not the official anything of the encampment, but he was the person people looked at when something needed to be decided, and he knew it. And he took it seriously in the quiet way of someone who has lost enough to understand that other people's safety is not a small thing. Donna Marsh was 56, a former ER nurse from Billings who had been living rough on and off for 6 years, following a sequence of events she summarized, when she summarized it at all, as a run of bad decisions compounded by one catastrophic one. She still thought like a nurse. She noticed things. She kept a small kit of basic medical supplies in a waterproof bag and had used it more times than she liked to count. Sylvia Crane was 44, a former middle school English teacher from Great Falls, quiet in the way of someone who had once talked for a living and now found silence easier. She carried a small spiral notebook and wrote in it every evening, sitting near whatever fire the group had managed, her handwriting small and precise. Old Pete, whom no one had a last name for, was somewhere in his late 60s and said almost nothing. He watched everything. He had appeared at the encampment one November morning 2 years prior and simply stayed, and by now he was part of the landscape in the way a particular tree becomes part of a landscape, noticed only in its absence. And there was Cody, 22, who had been there 4 months and still had the quality of someone expecting a phone call that would resolve the situation. Elena had already done the math 3 times by the time she started collecting materials. Not figuratively, literally. She had found a pencil stub and a piece of cardboard behind the library and worked through the thermal resistance calculations the way she would have at a workbench in Denver, except that this time the variables included her own body. And the question at the end was not a performance rating, but something considerably more direct. Corrugated cardboard has an R value of approximately R1 to R1, 5 per inch. 4 layers with air gaps between them, achieved by pressing dry leaves or crumpled newspaper between each layer, could realistically achieve R12 to R15 on a wall assembly. That was better than many manufactured housing units. Better than the single-pane windows in half the apartments in Bozeman. The ground beneath a sleeping person conducts heat away from the body significantly faster than still air does. A fact that most people sleeping rough got wrong in the most expensive possible way. A layered floor assembly with trapped air gaps addressed that problem directly. Thermal mass. Dark, dense materials that absorb solar radiation during the day and release it slowly overnight could add meaningful degrees to interior temperature during the critical early hours of a cold night when a body is still warming a space. These were not theories. They were the same principles she had spent 3 years testing in a materials lab, scaled down from commercial construction to one-person's survival. She had started gathering materials 11 days before the storm watch was issued. She walked 4 to 5 miles daily through the commercial corridors on Oak Boulevard and Main Street, checking the dumpsters and loading docks behind the appliance stores and furniture warehouses and restaurant supply companies. She brought back heavy industrial cardboard in the largest pieces she could carry, double-walled corrugated from appliance boxes, thick single-wall sheets from furniture crates. She found wooden pallets behind a restaurant supply warehouse on Commerce Drive and arranged them into a basic rectangular frame. She found 3 dark metal containers, the kind industrial lubricant came in, which she cleaned and filled with sand from the riverbank. She found nearly a full roll of silver HVAC tape in a contractor's recycling bin, which she regarded as something close to luck. What she did not find was any particular enthusiasm from the people around her. The cardboard appeared on day 3, and by day 4 the comments had started. Tex watched her work for 2 full days before he said anything. That was characteristic. He was not a man who spoke before he'd formed a complete thought. When he finally walked over, on the afternoon of the 4th day, he stood with his arms crossed and looked at the growing pile of flattened cardboard stacked against the pallet frame, and then he looked at Elena, and his expression was one she had learned to recognize in the months she'd been living rough. It was the expression of someone extending patience to a person they've tentatively classified as well-meaning but wrong. "What exactly are you building?" he asked. "Insulated shelter," Elena said. "With cardboard. With layered corrugated assemblies separated by air gaps," Elena said. "The cardboard is the material. The principle is thermal resistance." Tex looked at the pile again. In a Montana January. Especially in a Montana January. The exchange drew an audience, as exchanges in small encampments always do. Donna was close enough to hear, and had stopped pretending she wasn't listening. Cody was sitting on a log 20 feet away, with the focused attention of someone watching something that might become entertaining. Sylvia had opened her notebook. "I've been through 7 winters out here," Tex said. "I've seen people try all kinds of things. Cardboard gets wet. Wet cardboard is worse than nothing because it pulls heat out, which is why the exterior layer is covered with plastic sheeting, weighted and sealed at the seams," Elena said, "and why the roof pitch is designed to shed water rather than pool it. If the outer layer stays dry, the system works." She pulled a piece of cardboard from her jacket pocket, a folded sheet covered in pencil calculations. Tex looked at it, not dismissively. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they're trying to find a reason to disbelieve and not finding it as easily as they expected. "Where'd you learn this?" he asked. Elena folded the paper back into her pocket. "Materials engineering," she said. "Graduate degree. 3 years applied research." The silence that followed had a particular texture. Tex uncrossed his arms, which was something. He didn't say anything else. He walked back toward his own shelter, and Elena watched him go. And she understood that the conversation was not finished. It had just moved somewhere interior, where Tex would turn it over privately until he'd reached a conclusion. Donna caught Elena's eye and gave her a look that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. She worked for 7 days. The encampment watched, and the watching changed in quality over those 7 days, in ways that Elena noticed and filed without comment. Day 1 and 2, the watching was amused. Day 3 and 4, It was curious. Day 5 and 6, something had shifted. The Weather Service had issued its first special statement, and the numbers in the forecast had gotten specific enough that amusement was harder to maintain. By day 7, people were watching the way you watch something you are considering asking about, but haven't yet found the right angle to ask. The structure she built was rectangular, 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, framed with pallets lashed together with cordage she'd braided from strips of plastic bag where she'd run short of rope. The walls were 4 layers of cardboard each, offset so seams didn't align, with dry leaves and crumpled newspaper pressed between each layer. Every joint was sealed with HVAC tape, applied carefully at corners and seams, creating a genuine vapor barrier at the connections most structures failed at. The floor was 5 layers of cardboard over a base of dry leaves, addressing the conductive loss she had calculated as the single most underestimated variable. The roof was the heaviest cardboard she had, bowed slightly to shed water, with salvaged plastic sheeting over the top and scrap wood strips weighing the edges down. The door was a moving blanket hung over an opening she'd left in one wall, weighted at the bottom to hang straight and seal against drafts. Along the interior perimeter, she arranged dark river stones she'd carried back 2 and 3 at a time across 6 days. Dense, dark-colored, positioned to absorb whatever solar radiation came through the door during the day and release it slowly through the night. The 3 metal containers filled with sand sat at the corners. On the 6th day, she discovered that a section of the north wall had been pulled apart overnight. A large sheet of cardboard was missing. She looked at it for a long moment, then began repairing it, adding an extra layer where the gap had been. Cody didn't come near her that day. She didn't say anything to him. That evening, she noticed him watching her work from a distance, and the expression on his face was not what she'd expected. It wasn't defiance. It was something quieter and harder to name. January 13th. The National Weather Service upgraded to a winter storm warning at 6 a.m. The forecast was specific now, in the way forecasts become when the system has arrived close enough to model precisely. Temperatures dropping to -19 by midnight. Wind chill approaching -37 in exposed areas. Conditions expected to hold for 3 to 4 days. The tone of the encampment changed between breakfast and mid-morning in a way that was almost physical. People who had been casual about their preparations the day before were suddenly not casual. Tex had received a message through the camp's informal communication network. A friend of a friend had a floor he could sleep on for the night. Elena was close enough to hear him decline. He said he'd figure it out. She didn't say anything, but she noted it. Donna came to find Elena at mid-morning. She didn't ask for anything directly. She stood near the structure for a moment, and then she said, quietly, "What's the most dangerous thing for someone Ruth's age in a cold like this?" Elena understood immediately. Not the question, the reason for it. Donna had a friend, Ruth, 68 years old, who had been sleeping in a broken-down Buick LeSabre half a mile up the river road for the past 3 weeks. The car provided wind protection but no real insulation. In -19, it was a metal box. Elena and Donna walked up River Road together in the late afternoon, before the temperature started its serious drop, and they brought Ruth back with them. Patrice had been waiting near the structure when they returned. A woman of about 50 who had arrived at the encampment 2 weeks prior and said little about herself, only that she had driven up from Wyoming and her car had died outside of Livingston. Ruth didn't speak much. She was a small woman, with careful eyes who took in her surroundings, with the thoroughness of someone who had learned not to assume anything about a situation until she'd seen it herself. She looked at Elena's structure for a long time without saying anything. Then she nodded, once. Slowly, the nod of someone who has evaluated something and found it satisfactory, which is a different thing entirely from the nod of someone who is simply being polite. By the time the temperature began its serious drop at dusk on January 13th, 5 people had found their way into Elena's cardboard structure. Patrice settled in beside Ruth without ceremony. Tex came last, ducking through the blanket door without making a production of it, finding a space on the floor, and sitting down. He looked at Elena. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything about it. That was its own kind of conversation. Cody was not among them. Elena had looked for him once, before the temperature dropped in earnest, and had not found him. The temperature on the night of January 13th dropped to -19 in the Gallatin Valley. Sustained winds pushed the wind chill to between -32 and -37. Elena had lived in Colorado, had worked in unheated test facilities in winter, had understood cold as a variable in material performance testing. She had not, before this, understood it as a thing her body would interpret, as a continuous, low-level emergency signal for 8 consecutive hours. She tracked the interior temperature the way she'd learned to track ambient conditions without instruments, through breath vapor, through the feeling of air against her face, through the behavior of the small flame of a lighter. She clicked periodically and watched. Breath vapor in very cold air is dense and persistent. In less cold air, it thins and dissipates faster. She watched it thin over the first 2 hours as 5 bodies in an insulated space began to accumulate heat, and the watching gave her something to do with her attention that kept it away from the places it wanted to go. At approximately 2 in the morning, the blanket door moved. Cody came in on his hands and knees, which told her something was wrong before she saw his face. He was confused in the particular way of early-stage hypothermia, slow to respond, his words arriving separately from his thoughts, his hands shaking, with the effortful quality of muscles receiving signals they were having difficulty processing. Donna was awake immediately, moving with the automatic efficiency of someone whose professional training does not fully go away regardless of what happens afterward. She checked his extremities, his responsiveness, the color at his lips. She caught Elena's eye and gave a small nod. Manageable, but only just. Elena moved without discussion, giving Cody her space on the floor, repositioning herself against the wall. She did not sleep after that. She sat through the remaining hours of the night listening to 5 people breathe, watching the vapor of their breath, feeding warmth from stone and cardboard and the fact of being inside rather than outside. At its coldest point, she estimated the interior temperature at approximately 36 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was -19. The differential was somewhere between 55 and 60 degrees. The cardboard was doing exactly what the physics said it would do. Patrice woke first, before the light. She lay still in the dimness and took inventory of her own body, the way you do when you're not certain what you'll find. Fingers, toes, the feeling of air against her face. Everything was there. Everything worked. She was cold in the way that a hot cup of coffee fixes, which is a completely different category of cold from the kind she had been afraid of the night before. Around her, the others were beginning to stir. Elena had not slept. Tex went out first. Elena watched him through the gap in the blanket door. He walked around the structure slowly, looking at it from the outside. The roof pitch, the sealed corners, the plastic sheeting still intact, the walls still standing. He came back in and stood in the entrance for a moment. He looked at Elena. "You knew," he said. "I thought I knew," she said. "There's a difference." "But you built it anyway." "I built it anyway," she said. Outside, they found 2 men at the far end of the encampment who had spent the night in sleeping bags on open ground. Both were alive. One was confused and slow in a way that resolved over the following hour as warmth returned to him. The other had significant frostbite on his feet. He would need medical attention, and Donna was already making the decision to call for it when a county emergency services vehicle came down River Road on a welfare check. The young paramedic who stepped out looked at the scene, at Elena standing near the cardboard structure, at Donna directing attention toward the injured man, and addressed himself to Tex. "Who's in charge here?" he asked. Tex looked at him for a moment. "She is," he said, nodding toward Elena. The paramedic glanced at her and started to redirect toward Tex again, the way people sometimes do when the answer doesn't match what they expected. Tex didn't move. "She's the one who knew what was coming and built something that kept 5 people alive overnight in -19, he said. "I'd suggest talking to her." The paramedic looked at Elena again. Really looked, this time, and something shifted in his face. He nodded. "Okay," he said. "What do you need?" Elena told him. The cold held for 4 days. They stayed in the structure. On the second day, Cody asked Elena to explain why the layered cardboard worked. Not out of politeness, she understood, but out of something that had changed in him since 2 in the morning on the first night, some private accounting he'd been running that had reached a conclusion. He did not mention the north wall, and neither did she. But at the end of the explanation, he said, without looking at her directly, that he hadn't thought it would work. She said she had understood that. He nodded once, and that was the end of it. She explained the physics, the trapped air, the conductive heat loss, the R-value calculations. He listened the way people listen when the stakes have made everything concrete. On the third day, old Pete, who had not said more than a dozen words in the entire time Elena had been in the encampment, sat down next to her and watched her demonstrate how to fold cardboard to maximize the structural integrity of a layered wall section. He didn't speak. He watched, And then he did it himself, precisely, and looked at her, and she nodded. On the evening of the third day, she found out what Sylvia had been writing in her notebook. Sylvia had been recording the construction process from the beginning. Dimensions, materials, layering sequences, the thermal mass calculations Elena had explained during the building phase. She had organized it the way a teacher organizes a lesson plan, with headings and numbered steps and notes on the reasoning behind each decision. I thought someone should write it down properly, Sylvia said, in case it's useful somewhere else. Elena read through it twice. It was accurate. It was clear. It was better organized than anything she'd produced herself, because Sylvia understood how to make information accessible to someone encountering it for the first time. When the temperature broke on January 17th, a county outreach worker named Susan Wells had already been in contact with the encampment through the emergency services visit. She asked Elena if she would explain her construction method to a group at the Gallatin Community Resource Center on 7th Avenue. Elena said yes. The workshop was not polished. She was a materials engineer, not a teacher. And the gap between knowing something and knowing how to transmit it to others is wider than most experts expect. But Sylvia sat in the front row with her notebook. And when Elena stumbled over an explanation, Sylvia rephrased it. And the combination worked in the way that two different kinds of competence sometimes combine into something neither could achieve alone. What happened to Elena Voss afterward resists the clean shape that stories are supposed to have, and that resistance is part of what makes it true. Susan Wells connected her with a transitional housing program in late February. She stayed 4 months. A structural engineering firm in Bozeman. Small, 3 people. The kind of firm that does commercial retrofit work and energy audits for county buildings had heard about her through a chain of conversation that started with the county emergency management office and ended with a phone call. She was hired on contract in April of 2011, full-time by July. She moved into a rented room on the south side of Bozeman that summer and did not go back to the riverbank to sleep, but she went back to visit. Several times in the years that followed, she walked through the Cottonwood corridor along the Gallatin, and sometimes found people there, and sometimes found it empty. And when people were there, she brought supplies, and she talked with them. Not as someone who had escaped and returned as an authority, but as someone who knew what it felt like to sleep on that ground through a Montana winter, and build something in it that everyone said was wrong. Sylvia's document found its way to nonprofits in Billings and Missoula, and eventually to cold weather preparedness organizations across the northern Rockies. By the time it had traveled 2 or 3 steps from its source, Elena's name had largely dissolved from it. The way practical knowledge does when it becomes actually useful, it stops being attributed and starts being applied. Tex told the story for years. Donna told it to other nurses. In contexts where it illustrated things about improvised materials and body temperature regulation that were clinically relevant in ways that surprised her listeners. Cody told it, and in his version he had been slightly less certain before the fact than history recorded, which is a very human adjustment to make with a story about a night you were wrong. Old Pete never told it, as far as anyone knew. He just, the following winter, helped 2 newcomers to the encampment lay down a proper floor assembly, pressing leaves carefully between the layers of cardboard, doing it without explanation, which was its own kind of transmission. What the cardboard was, in the end, was not the point. Elena said this when the story came up in later years. The cardboard was just the material available. The point was that she had understood a set of physical principles, and she had applied them in conditions that made everyone around her certain they couldn't apply, and she had refused to accept that the unconventional nature of the materials meant the physics stopped working. The physics does not care what the material costs, or where it came from, or what it looks like stacked against a pallet frame in a riverside encampment. The physics does not negotiate. It just describes what happens to heat and to people when certain conditions are met. -19 outside, somewhere between 36 and 40 degrees inside. Call it 55 to 60 degrees warmer. Inside walls made of cardboard and salvaged plastic and wooden pallets from a loading dock on Commerce Drive. The kind of solution that doesn't appear in engineering textbooks because it doesn't look like engineering from the outside, but which kept 5 people alive through the coldest 4 days that city had seen in 20 years. The thinking was the point. The thinking and the refusal to stop trusting it when every voice around you was certain it was wrong. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. There are more like it waiting. And drop a comment telling me which moment hit hardest and where in the world you're watching from.
When the world around us you feel it anyway, and I was had nothing, no job, no home, no money. Such a great US degree, a pencil stub, and a price or cardboard. Why all the mocks her see cochlear? Why all the dapper CPU? Why all the waste for Q? She became the Q. Here was her story teacher us. If police doesn't care about your curriculum state, really lie inside you. Poverty cannot repossess it. Fire cannot fix it. The same physics that work in a Denver laboratory work on a frozen riverbank. The universe doesn't check your bank account before opening its law. The most dangerous thing isn't the cold, it's stopping Elafay skepticism tab exhaustion and manipulating degree darkness. She keep going not from blind optimism, but from something deeper. She just her thinking when every voice around her said she was wrong. Real leadership isn't an outcome. It's demonstrated. Nobody votes for Angela. She earned her authority the only way it eventually gets earned by being right is matter most and sharing the one is still or keep in is one woman separate couple Firelight said you less in your shelter with it especially when people are loving